Thank you very much all for joining us today. My name is Javier Puente, and I am an assistant professor of Latin American and Latino Studies at Smith College. I'm also Peruvian. The Smith College's Latin American and Latino Studies program, the Department of History and the Initiative for the Study of Latin American at Baruch College, and the online journal Age of Revolutions proudly joined to organize this emergency webinar on the Coup in Peru. We want to acknowledge the support of these institutions, our panelists, our IT specialist Maria Douglas, and everyone who has helped us spread the word about this webinar and events in Peru. Last night, 105 congressmen bent the Constitution and voted to impeach Constitutional President Martín Vizcarra, claiming his permanent moral incapacity to continue serving in the highest office of the country. Within hours, a now illegitimate Congress installed Manuel Merino de Lama as incumbent. In doing so, breaking the constitutional order of the nation, the Congress put a tragic end to 2 decades of precarious and unstable democratic transitions. Over the last few days, the Lama's regime has unveiled its authoritarian nature and increasingly dictatorial ambitions, repressing legitimate protests on the streets while conducting a series of political maneuvers intended to safeguard the impunity of corrupted circles of power. All of this is happening while the international community seems hesitant to acknowledge the legitimacy of the Lama's regime, and Peruvians continue to mobilize. An unprecedented crisis engulfs Peru and perpetuates the climate of upheaval in the Andean region. Today, we will have 3 panelists who will have an informal conversation about the origins, elements, repercussions, and possible consequences of the recent political events in Peru. We will welcome questions from the audience on a permanent basis. Please use the Q&A tool available on this platform. We expect the conversation to continue for an hour and a half. We also hope you will consider similar events organized by other institutions, including the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, University College of London, among others. Our first panelist is Professor Jo-Marie Burt. Professor Burt is Associate Professor of Political Science and Latin American Studies at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, and a Senior Fellow at the Washington Office of Latin America. She's also the author of multiple publications on state and insurgent violence in Peru, including the remarkable Silencing Civil Society, Political Violence and the Authoritarian State in Peru. Today, we're also joined by Professor Mark Rice. Professor Rice is Assistant Professor of History at Baruch College, City University of New York. He has published widely on Peruvian history and recently released his first book titled Making Machu Picchu, The Politics of Tourism in 20th Century Peru. Last, never least, we're also pleased to host Professor Caroline Yezer. Professor Yezer has published on the politics of memory in Peru's Church Commission, the crisis of indigenous citizenship in Ayacucho, and the conflict between village governance, women's rights, and demilitarization. Her co-edited book, Las Formas del Recuerdo, Etnografías de la Violencia Política en el Perú, was published by the Institute of Peruvian Studies. She has taught at College of the Holy Cross and Clark University. So without further ado, let me start in the order I have introduced you with some opening questions. Jo-Marie, what do you see as the central elements of this new episode of political crisis in Peru?
Hi, Javier, and thank you for organizing this panel discussion. So I think the key there's several key takeaways, but I'll just highlight maybe 2. The first one is that the removal of President Vizcarra is being widely interpreted by Peruvian society and by the international community as illegitimate. There are multiple signs of this, ranging from a series of statements from different sectors of Peruvian society, Catholic bishops, universities, civil society organizations, trade union organizations, and so forth, that you see the mass street protests for every day since the removal motion went through, increasing in number and intensity, as well as the police repression, but that's another matter that I think we can talk about in a minute. And virtually no government, no foreign government has recognized the Merino government. The OAS has said, let's evaluate this. International organizations have even called, the Human Rights Watch recently called for invoking the Democratic Charter. So this is a government that on its face, within 24 hours or 48 hours of taking power, has shown no gains in obtaining international or local legitimacy. The CONFIEP, the Peruvian business elite, is one of the few institutions that did recognize the Merino government. But other than that, it's a wide range of sectors that have not granted legitimacy to this government. And the second thing is to talk about, and I hope we can discuss this in more detail, I'm sure we'll discuss this in more detail, is who is behind this vacancy motion? Because on its face, it looks like, wow, you look at the numbers, 105 out of 130 members of Congress voted to remove this president. That seems pretty compelling. So if you just sort of think about Democratic numbers, the majority voted for this. The Constitution allows it. But there are several problems. The first one is that the term moral incapacity is an ambiguous one in the Peruvian Constitution. And it's really meant to refer to mental disability or some other grave measure that prevents the person from exercising their duties as president, right? And I'm not going to say a minor corruption case, but a corruption case of the kind of which Vizcarra is currently accused is something he should and would be investigated for right at the end of his term, but it's not really a motive for removing him as president, right? So there's serious questions about the logic behind the removal motion. But then you also have to look a little bit at the history. Merino, the president of Congress, who's now he's sworn in as president. I'm not going to say he is the president because a lot of people are refusing to acknowledge him as such. Wait, I lost my train of thought. What was I'm sorry, I completely lost my train of thought there. Unmute yourself, Caroline. Tell me what I was saying.
Who is behind this?
He's done too many interviews.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Oh my God. It's just been a really long morning, as I shared already with my co-panelists. I had a very contentious few meetings before this. The people who are behind this have been they've literally been in office only since, I think, March, right? This is a new Congress that is the result of the dismissal of the previous Congress by the president. So they've been in power for less than, 6-7 months, right? And one of their main goals has been to remove Vizcarra as president. Last September, Merino and several other allies sought to remove Vizcarra on another unrelated corruption charge. Just a charge, there's no proof in either case. And maybe the only reason it failed is because Ideal y Reporteros, Gustavo Gorriti, revealed that Merino and other members of Congress were actively seeking the backing of the armed forces for their new government under the assumption that they would be successful in removing him. This was back in September. And when that revelation was made public, it was just like the whole thing fizzled. But now they've come back with a vengeance. This is, as I have said to the international press, this is a coalition of the corrupt, of a series of political parties who are determined to roll back Vizcarra's admittedly very modest political reforms that are meant to reduce the role of corruption in public life, which we all know is an epidemic. We know that there is another epidemic, there's the COVID epidemic, but corruption has become an epidemic in Peruvian politics. Every living president, with the exception of Morales Bermudez, has been prosecuted, charged, or is under investigation for corruption. And I should just add, Morales Bermudez has been convicted of human rights abuses in Italy, and the Peruvian authorities have refused to extradite him, and they have refused to prosecute him for those issues. That's a whole nother matter. Every other president, and we know that Alan Garcia killed himself before allowing himself to be also arrested on corruption charges. So this is an epidemic. And what we have now is the people causing the epidemic are at the helm of the ship. And that is why you see tens and thousands of people, especially young people, risking their lives literally because of COVID out in the streets protesting to get this corrupt, usurping government out of office.
Thank you for that opening remark, Jo-Marie. And you mentioned that there is a short-term history, there is a trajectory, there are legacies at stake, and so that's a perfect way for queuing in Mark. Mark, how would you historicize these gruesome times in Peru? What is the trajectory, and what are the structures of corruption that have led us to this situation?
Hey, well, I'll do my best. Well, first of all, thanks so much to the organizers, the institutions that organized this, and to the participants. And I'll just get, bring a historical perspective. I do think that what's occurring in 2020 in Peru is this certainly a turning point, maybe a bookend of basically Peru's history since 2000, the fall of Fujimori. Just in case, I don't know what our audience is, for a little bit of context, Alberto Fujimori was the president of Peru from 1990 to 2000, who remained in power through various authoritarian actions, and is the author basically of the 1993 Constitution, which continues to politically govern Peru. And he falls under a mountain of corruption evidence in 2000. So, and this is kind of seen as a turning point for the post-Peru after Fujimori. And if you were to write the initial political narrative of this, of Peru since 2000, the two kind of antagonists of kind of this era preventing democratization and anti-corruption would probably be, the Fujimoristas, who remain and are led by his daughter, primarily Keiko, and the Opera Party, led by Alan Garcia. And what I find so shocking is Vizcarra, who I think arguably was probably the most politically adept president after Fujimori, actually defeated these two people in his short term. He was actually one of the few presidents that outflanked and outmaneuvered both Opera and the Fujimoristas. But yet, even after doing this, which he kind of culminates with the dissolution of Congress in 2019, he's still deposed now by basically this rather disparate group of parties, which actually really don't have an ideological agreement besides their common hatred of Vizcarra and his reforms, right? So I guess we have to see that, in many ways, the legacy of Alberto Fujimori wasn't really these parties. It was really the structures, which I think are are worth talking about. And in this case, I'm going to have to admit, I have to steal a little bit from the observations of Alberto Vergara in his book, Ciudadanos sin República. And he argues that Fujimori, when he was president, kind of constructed a political system which kind of had three big supports to it. One was business, big business. The other was a technocracy, which governed Peru through some ministries of Peru, which were actually quite efficient. Some are not, and kind of NGOs. And finally, kind of politics. But the problem was that Fujimori designed a system in which he was the political center of Peru, right? And actively worked to dismantle and attack other political parties, institutions that could also be political rivals. So with the fall of Fujimori, the business and technocracy remain in place. But the politics there is no political center, or there is no political weight. So there's kind of a vacuum there. So with the exception of using corruption as a way of unifying political coalitions, every other president has kind of had difficulty to really enact policy because you have to politically sell it to people. And in some ways, Vizcarra was kind of the last gasp of this. Vizcarra, in many ways, represented, and most of his reforms were rather technocratic. He was pushing for reform of government and pretty middle-of-the-road reforms. And ironically, in doing so, became politically the most popular president in Peru after Fujimori. His approval ratings were always like 60%, which was unheard of after any other president would have killed for that, So I guess we're seeing now is basically disparate interests who are now represented in Congress, who are basically now willing to kind of blow up the technocracy, willing to blow up the state to protect basically the only thing that's left, which is these business interests, right? So if, like you see, politics was already weak, but you had like a technocracy and business, now we're kind of seeing basically Vizcarra's rather middle of the road technocratic proposals are too much for even these guys. So they're kind of willing to blow up the state to protect basically their business interests, which are various, right? Private universities, evangelical and ultra-right Catholics who have a lot of property interests, Antuario Humala, who kind of has his own agenda to get out of prison and become a dictator. And finally, just placing basic immunity from prosecution, which I believe something like half of all of Congress is facing corruption investigations, and they want to avoid that. So that's kind of the historical thing I can lead to this. And I guess the last point I'll make, which I'm glad Jo-Marie also raised, which is this larger thing of corruption, which I think is something that maybe academics and politicians have to unpack, because corruption is kind of used, it's everywhere, but it's kind of used this blanket term. And I think we've seen in Latin America, not just in Peru, but this weird inverse of basically corruption, the theme of corruption being used as a political cudgel, again, to enable even more corrupt people, right? I mean, Vizcarra has definitely some accusations of corruption, but but we're seeing people with far bigger issues of corruption using these charges of corruption against him. And this echoes very similar to what happened in Brazil with the unseating of Dilma Rousseff, right? Which is kind of the same, very similar. But I said, even with like the charges against Evo Morales, and even in the United States, the charges against Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, right? Their corrupt butter emails. I think there's also this larger thing we have to think about is, how do we kind of talk about corruption in more detailed ways, which kind of, I think there is a difference between a kickback on a highway project and seeking to dismantle a judicial system, right? So I don't know, I don't have a solution to that, but I'd like to hear what people have to say. So that's my comments.
Thank you very much for those wonderful remarks, Mark. And you were mentioning Vizcarra, his identity, his trajectory. He was the governor of Moquegua, and the corruption allegations that were charged against him come from the time where he was serving as governor of Moquegua. He's a provinciano, right? So things matter beyond Lima, and for that, I would like to ask Caroline. So beyond Lima, in a narrative that is becoming increasingly Lima-centric, how do you see this crisis affecting the regions and provinces? And more importantly, perhaps, what role will the interior, as it's called in Peru, what role will the interior play in the next few days and weeks?
It's a big question. And I've been trying to look at Ayacucho over the past couple of days to try to figure that out and calling people there. And what I can tell you right now, I don't really have a succinct answer other than to say that definitely the people I'm talking to and what we're seeing in the news and the local news in Ayacucho is that the young people, especially the high schoolers and the university students, are committed. They say that they are going to protest until there is a change. So there's not like an end date. So they do seem to be in it to win it with Lima. However, of course, their numbers are so much smaller than Lima. I was asking a friend, however, just to look at a provincial capital, not Huamanga, which is bigger, but in Huanta, he covered the protests there, and he said he estimated that there was about 1,000 people there, which is pretty major in a small town that is being wrecked by COVID right now. So they say that they are going to stay in the plaza. Of course, we also have to think about it's the rainy season, it's going to get wet out there. So we'll see how much they stick to it. The other issue with the provinces, of course, is people always talk about, especially in the former war zone or the zone of violencia between the rebels, formerly known as the Shining Path, and the state, is that there was a big cleaving to Fujimori because he put in the schools, he put in the roads, he trusted the rondas campesinas with guns and things like that. So there is a slight tendency towards Fujimorismo out there. However, that's lessened a lot. And I think if you talk to people from there, people will still, people in the countryside will say, Don Fujimori, like, we still care about him, but they're not feeling the same way about his daughter. And they're angry about the corruption as well. So I don't see Fujimorismo having as much of a hold there. However, there are all these other elements that you guys have already brought up. To what extent does Antaro Humala still have some sort of foothold, especially in the VRAM, like the Apurimac, Montaro, what river am I missing? The Apurimac, Montaro, and NA Valley, which is like the #1 producer of pasta básica de cocaína right now, and all the narco politics there. Antaro was really popular with a certain kind of militarized coca grower out there, so we'll see what happens with that. And there's of course, already surfacing what Jo-Marie has so famously called quien habla es terrorista, this kind of like what we would think of as the US as this like post-Cold War, this Cold War rhetoric of like, anyone who protests is a communist, is a red, is a, that is a story that doesn't have a lot of content to it, but it can be used to slap onto anything. So we're seeing, people say, that Vizcarra is a communist, for example, which doesn't make sense at all. But to what extent that still holds as a rhetoric in the interior, in the former war zone, we'll find out. Hopefully it doesn't, because the generations we're seeing that are taking to the streets, of course, they don't operate like that. They don't have that Cold War rhetoric. So hopefully their calls, I love their posters. They say you picked the wrong generation to mess with, things like that. And then finally, I just want to highlight the importance of education in Ayacucho and a lot of these rural areas. As some of you may know who have studied the rise of the Shining Path education and the attack on education for the sons and daughters of the peasantry out there, really led to a kind of a place in which Shining Path stepped in and was able to capture some of the passions of some of the urbanized sons and daughters of the peasantries. So I'm not saying that Shining Path is going to come back or anything like that. They're still out there somewhere doing their thing. But basically, it does point to the importance of education. And in a very strange way, the issue of the new government, or the fake government of Merino, everybody is holding their breath, thinking that he's really going to destroy the educational reform that forced universities not to prey on people. So you have a kind of Trump university effect that has happened since the neoliberalization of the Fujimori years, in which you have an awful lot of for-profit private universities, some good, some bad. And I think a lot of people in these rural areas who are going to public universities are aware that they need the accreditation in order to rise in the ranks and become professionals. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I just want to remind the audience that this is an event intended to have a conversation with you. So keep sending your questions. I'm going to share some of the questions that some of the attendees have been posting on the Q&A. So let me start with this intriguing question, and maybe Jo-Marie would like to start. Which parties and figures in Congress are the driving force behind the coup or the impeachment, as it's technically called, but in reality it's a coup?
Myself, sorry. So, I mean, 105 out of 130 members of Congress voted for the vacancy, the removal of the president. It's not exactly the same as impeachment. I know it's often translated the same way, but it's a little bit different. The Popular Action Party, Acción Popular, is the Merino party. They were one of the leaders. Merino was one of the leaders. And after the fact, the Popular Action Party actually issued a statement distancing itself from the removal of Vizcarra and the assumption of power of Manuel Merino. The other parties involved are the Alliance for Progress, APP, the Cesar Acuña party. He's one of the guys who owns one of these for-profit private universities, which he has made a ton of, sorry, I was going to use a bad word. He's made a ton of money with this private university, and that sort of propelled him into political life. And the allegations are that he actually uses the profits from that private university to fund his campaign efforts. Podemos Peru, which is run by Jose Luna Galvez, who I believe was recently arrested the other day, right? Over questions about the registration of Podemos Peru as a political party. This is also the party of Daniel Urresti, former Minister of Interior, retired general, accused of homicide in the 1988 murder of journalist Hugo Bustillos. He was acquitted of that murder in 2000 something, what the year that the municipal elections took place, 2017 maybe, 2018? 2017. He almost won the mayorship of Lima, but he did not. And the Supreme Court has ordered a retrial, has said that they're not convinced by the acquittal and has ordered a retrial. So he still faces charges in that case. Unión por Perú, this is Jose Vega's party, also Antauro Humala's party. As Mark mentioned, Antauro Humala is in jail. He's been in jail for over a decade now because of the uprising that he led in Andahuaylas to overthrow the sitting government at the time. I think it was 2006, 2004, God, 2005. All right, around there. And UPP has made very clear that they want a humanitarian pardon for Humala so that he can be released from prison so that he can run for the presidency, which is extremely problematic. But anyway, Fuerza Popular, Keiko Fujimori's party supported this. FREPAP, which didn't really have much of a presence politically until this new Congress came to power, but I think they have over 20 votes. They voted for this. And several members of the left voted for this. There are only 2 members of Congress, Mirta Vázquez and Rocio Silva Santisteban, who did not vote, who voted against the removal motion. So the left, several members of the left also voted for this, which is interesting. But I think the thing that unites most of these parties, I'm not going to talk about FREPAP because I don't know enough about them, but the thing that unites AP, APP, Podemos Perú, Unión por el Perú, and Fuerza Popular is their interest in, number one, undermining anti-corruption efforts and specifically removing or weakening the entity within the public ministry that's investigating organized crime and corruption. If you'll remember 2018, the Fiscal de la Nación at the time tried removing the 2 fiscales who were doing the most investigations into the Odebrecht case. I'm not remembering their names right now. I should remember their names because they're like heroes. And people went out massively in the streets to defend a couple of government prosecutors. It's very odd, but it's because they became the face of anti-corruption efforts in Peru. Right? So they want to stop that. They want to roll back the reforms of higher education that have resulted in the disaccrediting, I don't know what the word is in English, of all of the private universities that Acuña, Luna, and Vega, and the other guys have. The person who is the prime minister of this new government, Flores Arauz, who's an old hand politician. He used to be of the PPC, the Christian Popular Party. I think he was elected to Congress in 1985, and he's been around ever since, a very old-time politician. He ran in 2016 to run for in 2016, he founded his own party called the Order Party, which tells you something about his political tendencies. He got like 0.5% of the vote. Right, he was 10 out of 10 in the election. Not a very popular guy. He was the Minister of Defense for Alan Garcia in 2007, and in 2009 when the Baguazo happened. He's the guy who refers to Peruvians in the highlands as llamas and vicuñas. He is racist. He is misogynist. He is pro-military. He's all about conservative values and interests. So that this is who is in power right now. And behind them, I think it's important. I already mentioned that CONFIEP, the business elite, have expressed their support. Opus Dei is behind some of these guys. And it's also important to mention Otto Gibovich, who is a member of Congress. He was involved in the effort to remove Vizcarra in September. He was one of the other ones, along with Merino, who was calling up the military, trying to get military. He himself is a former general. Once a general, always a general. A retired general. He was the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. When he was commander-in-chief, he's the guy who published, Mark, you'll be interested in this. He published a report called En Honor a la Verdad, in honor of the truth, which is basically the Army's response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report. They say, oh, no, there were not grave and systematic human rights violations. There may be a few bad apples here and there, but we are heroes. We saved the country. That's who Gibovich is. So I'm not saying that there's a large representation of armed forces here, but there are probably a certain sector of maybe retired military who align with the conservative views of people like Flores Arauz that are behind this, right? I do think there is an institutional military that has developed to some degree. And if you remember what happened in September, that institutional military stood up to the Merino attempt to remove Vizcarra. Said, no, we are not getting involved in this. We are non-deliberative. You guys figure it out, right? So that's, where that goes from here is really probably, but the intention of politicizing the military by the guys who are now in power is extremely worrisome to me. And what we're seeing on the streets right now, massive police repression of peaceful protest. That's where this goes from here. It is not good.
Thank you, Jo-Marie. And there are a couple of questions that are related to hemispherical dynamics, and I think they could have an interesting historical answer, Mark. So let me pose this for you. Is the U.S. involved? We have seen U.S. involvement in every single coup attempt or real coup over the last century. Do you think the U.S. could be somehow involved? And also another hemispherical question is, how does this coup connect with what happened in Chile over the last 14 months or so?
For me, well, I have to. Jo-Marie probably knows more about this, but I don't think the U.S. is involved in this. I think the U.S. is pretty ambivalent. I think the U.S. usually wants stability in the hemisphere above all else, and I don't see this fitting into any of those agendas in any way. And also the US tends to be, for better or for worse, have the drug war. And these guys, a lot of these guys are involved with kind of in money laundering. There's a lot of shady links with trafficking. So I don't think the US really is necessarily, I would say, ambivalent to this. If anything, probably a little bit wary of this. I don't think they really, because I said, these guys are really just blowing up the state, and the US kind of they like, good finance ministries and good central banking, and these guys are not interested in that, right? So I would say, I don't actually think the US has any involvement in certainly not encouraging this. And if anything, I would, just based on, I said, I don't know any of this, but just based on historical experiences and what the US's goals in the Andes have been for the past 20 years, I don't see the US having any interest in this. As for connections to Chile, I don't think at least the leaders of this initiative were really looking to Chile either. If anything, they seem to be pretty deliberately blind to the events in Chile, right? As I said, if you are a politician in Peru, you basically spent the last year looking at Chile going, wow, they had people angry about corruption and we sent a bunch of armed police in to beat them up, and that produced a much broader revolution. Let's do that again. Exactly. So in a strange, so I don't think that, they seem to be actually, if anything, following the same mistakes that that Piñera made in response to this initiative. So I guess that's. But I would like to hear what other people have to say.
Thank you, Mark. We can come back to questions as we move forward, but I want to cover as many as possible questions asked by our audience. And I have one here that maybe would be good for Caroline. Are concerns about political corruption widespread across communities and demographics in Peru, or are they more concentrated in certain segments of the population? How does high political corruption affect people in their day-to-day lives in Peru?
Good question. I mean, the anthropologist in me wants to talk about a little bit about compadrazgo, and there's a kind of, there's a kind of informal way in which in the countryside, you do have a tradition of, powerful gamonales or landowners having relationships of reciprocity with poor peasants, so that peasants do tend to vote along with the elite interests in certain ways. And some anthropologists look at this and say, this kind of quid pro quo, we gloss it as corruption in the West, but in certain ways it might offer a more softer landing than straight up capitalist markets do. So you always have like some big daddy to like cushion you, although he's also like the community's, honestly rapist. A lot of these landowners were in the region that I work in. So there's a lot of tolerance for kind of local things, but I think that that's changing. And one of the things we can relate to that is the education of the poor sectors and the rural sectors, and the continuing migrations to Lima and Huancayo and other big cities, where you see a lot of kids of the people who maybe didn't finish secondary school, learning about democracy and taking on, combining with what they know from their communities, a kind of international sensibility about what kind of checks and balances there can be. So not that, the Andes didn't always have their own forms of democratic innovations, but they have a more of a plurality, it seems now, with the professionalization of the countryside. So again, I don't know what's going to happen there, because this is a very tenuous advancement of people in the countryside, like in Ayacucho. But hopefully, from what we're seeing in the protests, a lot of the people, again, who are taking part in the protests in the streets, they've got family back in the countryside. So I think there is a change going on with how people think about traditional forms of politics. And it's been going on for a while. So, whether it was the Shining Path bringing in Mao's Little Red Book and people bringing that to the discussion about how, the poor shall inherit the earth, etc. Then you have, these same kids going to school and learning about human rights. That sort of was a new thing in the 90s in the areas that I worked in. So I think that things are wide open in terms of what can happen. And I think that unless everybody goes back to the countryside and we stop this kind of rural urban migrations, that progress won't change. However, I will say with COVID, we are seeing a return to the countryside of people, because so many people, I don't know if it's like 70%, I read the stat recently, so many people rely on the informal sector, so they don't have unemployment to fall back on or anything. They're going back to their communities of origin, and that's definitely happened. So we'll have to see how coronavirus affects this this progress of the professionalization of people in the campo.
Thank you, Caroline. Jo-Marie, next week the Tribunal Constitucional, the equivalent to the Supreme Court, can make a crucial decision for the future of the country. What can happen? What do you happen? There are so many questions about the Constitutional Court, the Tribunal Constitucional. Tell us.
It's kind of amazing, right? how important suddenly these judicial bodies seem to have become. And I think it really does reflect something that political scientists and anthropologists have been talking about for a long time, the judicialization of politics, right, in this sort of post-Cold War era. Next week, the Constitutional Court has said that it will hold a hearing to determine whether the removal motion that was voted upon on Monday that resulted in Vizcarra's being removed as president is constitutional or not. And that basically goes back to what I said at the beginning about an evaluation of whether the term moral incapacity, which is extremely vague, right, applies here. My you know, anything can happen, right? My sense is that it's hard to predict. They could rule that it's unconstitutional, and that would, I'm not sure, it would result in what? An annulment and then a rollback. So would Vizcarra become president again? That seems problematic, especially now that his passport has been taken away and they've issued a travel ban against him. He can't leave the country for 18 months because they've now opened a formal investigation into him because of these alleged corruption charges. Could there be an interim government appointed that has some greater legitimacy? Some people have floated that idea around. But it always seems risky to me to place our hopes in the decision of an unelected body or a tiny body of individuals. I think that if the protests continue, which to my mind, there's every indication that they will, that is going to create a genuine pressure on the part of the Constitutional Tribunal to deem this vacancy motion unconstitutional. And then the question then is what happens, right? Because otherwise you're setting up a situation of, assuming these protests continue, of just continued instability and repression. And that is not good for anybody, not only because of COVID, I mean, that's a major concern, but just it's not good for economic recovery, which was starting, my understanding is that was starting to happen, even in the context of COVID. That's not good for business, obviously, this climate of uncertainty and of violence and of state violence, because my understanding is that the protests have been peaceful and that the violence is coming from state forces, whether they are official police or individuals who are sent out to provoke, right? So there's a lot hanging in the balance with the Constitutional Tribunal. And I mean, I'm hopeful, but I'm also leery about putting all our eggs in that one basket as a solution to this, what is a much bigger problem, right?
If I can add, just talking about the legal terms to put, I guess, the history, I mean, what's just crazy about this is the whole issue of this moral incapacity really wouldn't even be an issue except for basically a trivial moment in history, which when Fujimori flees Peru to Japan to avoid prosecution, he famously faxes his resignation into the Congress. And at the time, the Congress basically, just because they wanted to stick it to Fujimori, just says, well, we're not going to accept, they wanted to fire him, right? And so they said, well, how do we fire him? Oh, well, let's use this moral incapacity clause, right? Which was this afterthought, which no one had heard of, but yet now has blossomed into this thing to bring down governments, so it just adds to like the legal complexity of this, right?
Can I just follow up on that? Because I think that's a really important point. Although the fact of the matter is that Fujimori abandoned the country with a ton of suitcases, allegedly, presumably that contained evidence, right, of his wrongdoing. We've never seen the videos that Montesinos had of Fujimori, right? Number one. And number two, he faxed his resignation. I mean, he abandoned his position. So in fact, moral incapacity one could argue, could be valid in that instance. The problem is actually that Peru is still operating under the constitution that Mr. Fujimori himself put in place in 1993 after a coup that got rid of the 1979 constitution, which was the result of a broad consultative process, right? This isn't a constitution that was put in place after a coup. plain and simple. And there has been some tinkering around with that constitution, but that constitution, I mean, there has not been the groundswell we see in Chile today, or we've seen in Chile the last 6 months, to push back on the Pinochet constitution, but it is not a dissimilar situation. And there, I have seen some comments, some, carteles in the protests saying, we got to get rid of this constitution. But, I'm not sure that Peru is there yet. And who would do that? Who would be the members of the Constituent Assembly that would actually carry this out is another question, because the problem of political representation in Peru is one of those big context issues that I sort of demurred to earlier, but I think that is just that Peru has to figure that out.
Thank you. And you were mentioning political outcomes, developments, and some limited change in political actors. But one of the seemingly big players in politics, whether Peruvian, Latin American, or maybe global politics, are entrepreneurs, businessmen, right? And so some of our attendees are curious about the identity and the role of the CONFIEP. Who is the CONFIEP? Who are they? What's their history? Who would like to talk a little bit about the CONFIEP?
Jo-Marie.
No one wants
to take it away.
I mean, the CONFIEP supported Fujimori. I mean, do I need to say more? I mean, CONFIEP has historically played an extremely conservative, at times reactionary role in Peruvian politics. They were not supportive of the efforts to run Fujimori out back in the late 1990s when people had had enough of his government. They stuck with him to the very bitter end for obvious reasons, because he was their best friend. I mean, this was a government that imposed neoliberalism a sangre y fuego, right? And we still have that model in Peru. Right? And that's one of the reasons, I just want to say this, that's one of the reasons why COVID is so bad in Peru compared to every place else in Latin America. Peru is nearing 1 million cases of COVID. It has I think it's now the third highest mortality rate for COVID. And one of the reasons is the neoliberal economic system, which gutted the state sector and especially gutted public health. I mean, which was bad to begin with, but now it's 1 million times worse. 1 million times worse. And that's one of the reasons why, in addition to what Caroline was mentioning, the fact that so many Peruvians are in the informal sector, so they have absolutely no cushion to fall back on, right? So the business elite, like many business elites in Latin America, are insular, they're navel gazing, they care about their bottom line, they don't really care about their fellow citizens. And it's terrible to say that. It makes me really sad, but that's the way it is.
There is another very intriguing question about the actors behind the scenes, right? So entrepreneurs are one of them. The CONFIEP certainly is there. Evangelical groups have been playing a key role in certain political outcomes throughout the hemisphere. So I don't know, maybe Caroline, would you like to say something about Peruvian evangelical groups?
Oh boy. Yeah. I can give you just a little window from Ayacucho. Again, it's a little different in Lima, but it's amazing how much evangelical groups really capture the imagination of people, I guess, who are now in their 40s and 50s in Ayacucho, who perhaps were forced into different sides of the violence and now have to live together as neighbors. I was just thinking about this the other day because one of my comadres passed away out there. And I remember the last time I heard from her was that her husband was beat up by another compadre of mine in the in the village. It's very Pueblo Chico, Infierno Grande. And they what helps them get over that is kind of the evangelical churches. There were 2 evangelical churches last time I was there in the village. One is Assembly of God, which is very big in Peru, coming from the US. And then the other was Presbyterian, but it was a kind of born again Presbyterian. And it kind of gave a lot of people in the war zone, but also people who migrated to Lima, a renacer, like a rebirth, a way to articulate their stories about having been in a very sinning past, whether that was, on the side of the state or the shining path, or caught in the middle, forced to perhaps participate in a massacre or to torture people as ordered by their army captains, for example. A way to kind of put that past into, encapsulate it, not forget about it, but to live together again. And it's a tenuous existence out there when people return to their communities. So it has me wondering now about how the people who are coming from Lima are going back to the communities. I know a lot of them are evangelical, and fitting in again to this very tenuous grasp on peace in these fractured communities. In terms of the political parties in FREPAP, again, I have to say I am a little bit ignorant there. That wasn't as big of a deal where I did my research, but it's something that I've been interested in because a lot of the churches and even the NGO World Vision out there do tend to sway elections. You'll even have people, they're not supposed to be running, but people will know like, oh, so-and-so is running for Cosecha, like a local party out there. And people know them because they administered funds from World Vision, for example, which is known, not necessarily ideological, but is known to be associated with evangelical churches. So I don't know exactly what the relationship is between Ayacucho and Lima. I can look at the news in Lima and see how, for example, when Keiko ran, her words at Harvard University, I was actually there to see them, where she said that she would be in favor of some abortions. That really had an effect on her party, I think, because I actually I recorded it and put it on social media when she said that. And then the next day, somebody had resigned from her party, one of the congresistas, and it just, so I think that that same thing that is swaying elections here in the US, a kind of reactionary religious belief that might be siding with Opus Dei in a weird way, might be active here. But I need to investigate it more.
And I guess this is an open question for all panelists, but how much, there are a couple of them related to this question, to this problem. How much do you see Merino resorting on violence, resorting on weaponizing and politicizing the armed forces and police repression within the next few days and weeks? How much authoritarian can Merino get?
I mean, we're already seeing it, right? We're already seeing kind of the indiscriminate use of police force against unarmed, non-violent protesters, right? We're seeing attacks on journalists. We're seeing the arbitrary detentions of human rights defenders. The second day of protests, a lawyer from the National Human Rights Coordinating Committee was arrested. I mean, in all my years of work with the Coordinadora, I can't recall, one or two times maybe, did a lawyer from the Coordinadora, face actual arrest for doing their job of defending people in these cases. I'm worried about the role of the military, but I am hopeful that the military learn something from the Civil War. I could be wrong. That does worry me, though. I mean, you have people like Gibovich, you have people like Flores Arauz, who are very tight with certain sectors of the military, who are, connected to the military that was part of the war that sees themselves as victorious. And if they're framing nonviolent protesters as terrorists, as Movadef, which is the political party of Shining Path, supposedly, that worries me. So, yeah, that worries me. I should also say that the person who's the head of the Ministry of Justice inspires zero confidence in me.
That's an interesting point. We were saying who's behind this, and what's interesting. I just was looking at this today. I have no idea what the connection is at all. But with the interesting cabinet, if you look at who's joining this cabinet, it's a lot of people from Alan Garcia's government, which is, I don't know what to make of that, but it's just interesting. A lot of maybe it's because they were the only ones that didn't have jobs. Maybe, I mean, like they were the ones that didn't have any political future, so they're like, well, might as well do it. But
they're the only ones que no tienen sangre en la cara.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know but it's kind of interesting to see who is filling these ministries, and it's a lot of people from Alan Garcia's second government. I don't know what to make of that, and I don't know what that means for opera or anything, but it's just interesting to see.
So the other side, civil society, right? We saw at least one journal of protests, one day of massive protests, but they are continuing. There is a misconception out there that Peru is not a country of protests, right? And people tend to forget that Cuatro Suyos ousted Fujimori. What can fuel a sustained social mobilization, the one that is needed for really shaking this illegal regime enough so that maybe international pressure will force Merino to some prompt democratic transition?
I think that's the big challenge, because they're saying that was Fujimori, destroyed a lot of the traditional basis for institutions that can maintain protest, right? Political parties, labor unions, things like that. So that's the big challenge, right? Is that if you look at, for example, Bolivia, their protests, they had a lot of grassroots institutions that could sustain resistance to that kind of coup government. And Chile, I think, had a lot more grassroots institutions. So I think that's the big challenge for Peru. The one interesting, I haven't seen him much in the news, but the guy who actually stands to benefit if you could channel this movement is Julio Guzman, right? Who is the one? It's interesting to see. His political career. He was a presidential candidate, but his Partido Morado was the only party that unanimously voted against this in Congress, and that it would be kind of interesting to see if he's smart, he could use this to be like, hey, we're the one party. But I don't know if he's capable of doing that. But that's the interesting person that might be able to at least emerge as a leader of this. I don't know if he can, but
yeah. Can I just follow that up? I think two things about Guzman. So he ran for president he tried to run for president. He was removed in 2016? What role has he personally played in the politics of Peru in these last 4 years? His party is in Congress. What has he done? So I honestly don't think that his leadership is, he tried to run for president. He did inspire some people. And he possibly he would have won had he been able to actually participate in the elections before being removed, right? It's possible because it was a wide open field. But I don't see that he's played a role that bestows upon him the kind of legitimacy you would need to be recognized by the kids on the street as, oh, that's the person I want to follow. That's the person who's inspiring me, who has led, right, our anti-corruption campaign. No, I don't think that that's going to happen. Now, the one thing I do think I think you're right, Fujimori, that's what my whole book is about, undermining civil society. However, in 98, 99, 97, 2000, you saw a resurgence, tiny, but it grew against Fujimori's, especially against his authoritarianism and against his corruption. And I was at the Marcha de los Cuatro Suyos every day for 3 days in a row. I got tear gassed. I watched people get hit by police. It was massive. And it didn't result in the immediately removal. Fujimori actually took power, remember. It wasn't until those videos showing Montesinos taking money from Alex Curi that first Montesinos fled, and then a couple months later, Fujimori fled, okay? But if you think about every time Fujimorismo has tried to come to power, or has come close to coming to power in Peru, there has been massive street protests demonstrating that there is a strong social movement in Peru that rejects corruption, the corruption of the Fujimoris of this world. And when there have been, really key moments that also threaten the anti-corruption element, like the attempt to sack those 2 prosecutors in 2018. Again, social movements came out to protest. The Ley Pulpín, remember that one, Javier? Mass street protests. Right. The problem is that Peru's political system has imploded. There are no real political parties to speak of anymore. There are political vehicles. They're vehicles for individuals like Cesar Acuña or Antauro Humala to run for office and become, president or member of Congress. But parties don't do what they are supposed to do in a democracy. And so you have this social energy that's out there. We see it. I mean, every night, if you look on your Facebook feed or your Twitter feed, you are seeing people out there in the streets, not just in Lima, all over the country. It is incredible, right? And who is the person channeling that? There is no, it is go ahead.
No. So with that in mind, because there's a question that exactly addresses that, what's going to happen in the elections of 21 if they happen? Is the bicentennial of the country too, right? I mean, many folks out there don't know that in 2021, Peru celebrates its bicentennial of independence, quote unquote independence. What's going to happen in the elections of 21?
Man, I got my money on Veronica Mendoza, right? I don't know. I would love.
Who is she? Who is she, Caroline? Can you tell me?
Veronica. Wait, what's her last name? I just
Mendoza. Veronica Mendoza.
Mendoza.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So I don't even remember what bancada she's with now because it's changed so much. But
isn't it Nuevo Peru?
That sounds good. Let's go with that. I think so. Here's where my fantasy is. It might be my fantasy world, but the things I saw, and again, I'm going on social media. We're not there right now, but the things I've seen about there is a kind of consciousness raising about Chile, about the new constitution. Wouldn't it be cool if one of the next candidates, assuming that there is an election in April, which they say this is going to happen, but now everybody's scared that they're going to postpone that or something. Wouldn't it be great if somebody jumped on the new constitution wagon? I think that's something she could do. She's such a face of the anti-Fuji movement in the last election, to me. Okay, my opinion.
Mark, Jo-Marie?
Well, I mean, as I said, I agree with Jo-Marie that I do not think Guzman is the savior of Peru, but if I was his political campaign advisor, I would be telling him, you need to be at the front of every march in Lima. I mean, he's the guy that could capitalize on this. I don't know if he's capable of that, but, I mean, the worst case scenario.
Technocrat. I mean, that's not really his thing, right? He's a technocrat.
Yeah, he is. But so is Martin Vizcarra. And I think by simply saying I'm going to do what I'm going to cumplir what Martin Vizcarra could be a popular.
That is possible. That is possible.
I said,
Vizcarra's not leading no social movements either.
I said, well, and that was, I said, and that's the problem of that's the problem of Peru since 2000 is that I agree with you. There's been a groundswell of protests, but I mean, I guess I'm revealing my affinity for institutions, I guess. But the protests they stop a measure or a law or a firing, but without a party, without labor, there's not that you don't have a. Protests they're kind of these stopgaps for emergencies, but to get actual policy done, you need people there for the boring times, right? To get through the regular laws. And I think that's what Peru is kind of lacking, right? And has lacked, right? So, I don't know what the solution is to that, but that's, but I guess recognizing that problem is part of it. So.
Can I just say that one thing that's the role of the international community is like to cover the protests? I mean, that's the biggest problem right now, is to get that on the front pages so that there is a voice heard, because otherwise, if you look at the official story, it's so, oh, we impeached the president. That's what they're saying. And that's it. And nobody has to pay attention. So before we even can talk about, getting beyond this or pressuring the international community, pressuring the coup to like step back or to at least stop the repression, you do need to have the spotlight on the protesters, on their signs that they've made, on their messages on social media.
And that goes back to something that we saw even in the Fujimori era, which is that the mainstream media in Peru is controlled by a very tiny number of people, very powerful, very rich people. And they shape the discourse, they shape what the majority of Peruvians see is the news, right? And this is a problem throughout Latin America, right? And so I think you're right, Caroline, that international press coverage of the state violence against protesters is extremely important, because then it kind of forces the local press to respond, to cover it. So I think that is really important.
I think that sort of answers the question of what is foreign media getting wrong, right? I mean, the idea behind organizing this event is that there was a narrative that was getting installed out there that used the term impeachment. And impeachment just sounds way too legal for what happened here. But what other things that foreign media is getting wrong? Is there anything else that you think the international community and an international audience like the one we have right now, should know to get things right?
Well,
yeah.
You want to go ahead, Karen? Go ahead.
I'll be really quick. They should know that there's different levels of corruption. They really need to be able to kind of separate between, not that I don't want to dismiss any allegations of corruption, but like, they really need to see like that somebody taking a bribe when they were a governor way back in 2013 or whatever, that needs to be separated from what's going on now with the congresistas that actually might be going to jail if they lose their terms. So there needs to be more understanding of corruption and not lumping it all together.
I want to follow up on that, if you don't mind. So I've been doing a lot of work in Guatemala recently, and there's a similar problem in Guatemala whereby numerous members of Congress are connected to these very dark circles of corruption, money laundering, drug trafficking, organized crime, I mean, you name it. And they're doing similar kinds of things, trying to kind of, in Spanish we call it cooptar, so co-opting democratic institutions so that you maintain the facade of democracy. The Congress is still there, the presidency is still there, there's still this formal separation of powers, but in fact, everything is being run by this alliance of corrupt people. In Guatemala, they call it el pacto de corruptos, the pact of the corrupt, right? And I think that's what we've seen develop here in Peru. It's like going back in time to the worst of the Fujimori era, without the Shining Path War. I mean, we know the Shining Path is kind of out there, but they're not a major political actor anymore. And there's certainly, no one would say that there's a war going on in Peru anymore. But the role of corruption in this particular moment and how people are acting based on their own private interests, right? And then I think something that Mark was getting at, which is how do you rebuild a political system whereby you can have representatives in Congress who are, honest people who are doing the job that we envision a congressman does, which is taking care to ensure the good of the people. How do we build that kind of political system, those kinds of institutions? I mean, we might even have to think about that for us here in the United States as well, given what we've just lived through. I don't think this is at all unique to Peru or Guatemala. And I do think that that is a sobering thought to end my comments with, but I think I'll just leave it there for now.
There seems to be something pervasive about corruption. You know, it's continuing the conversation, almost sort of like grassroots fed, right? Like a grassroots fed Fujimorismo as well. Why is corruption so deeply entrenched in the everyday political life of Peru? And are we just seeing a political representation of things that belong to daily practices in this country?
I should let the anthropologist answer this question, but that argument about a culture of corruption, I mean, I think that's baloney. I think that, sure, people pay bribes because what choice do they have? Right? What choice do they have? I tried to get married in Peru. It's a long story. You have to pay bribes, no matter. I've paid bribes in Peru. Yes, I have. Caroline, have you paid bribes in Peru?
Hell yeah.
I'm sure you have, because it is the way of the world in Peru, because institutions don't work, because the checks and balances don't work, because this is a deeply unequal country in which a very tiny plutocracy controls things, right? And corruption is, I don't know, some people even argue that corruption is a way to keep the system moving, right? In the face of limited social mobility, in the face of other kind of obstacles to I don't know. I don't know. I don't have a really good answer. I just had to say that. I want the anthropologist to answer though.
After Mark.
No, I would agree that I think that's what I don't have a good solution, and I don't want to be the guy saying, I don't want to be the pro-corruption panelist, but I think I think this is what I was talking about. There's this broad blanket term corruption, and I think we're applying corruption both to like real nefarious deeds, and at the same time, what in some ways you would kind of tie to more historically would call client networks, right? That are the clientelist networks, which have a long structural history in Latin America, which aren't necessarily seen as, it's kind of seen more as like an unofficial tax than as a nefarious crime, and I think by lumping, as I said, the types of kind of client relationships, which I'm not approving of, but by linking kind of these client relationships of you get a 2% kickback, so that's how you get the contract for a road moving, and you pay to jump to the front of the line or get a license to open up your shop. Like that's a very different. These are kind of client networks. And then, and what's going on in Congress is something very, very different, right? And I think I think we do ourselves as political observers, and I have to confess, even as historians and academics, a kind of a disservice by kind of using this corruption, which kind of ties in a lot of these other types of actions, which people themselves might not see as corrupt, right? I don't know if that makes sense, but that's my two.
Yeah, I think a good example of this is like, if you call the cops and you're way out in a shanty town, in Pueblo Joven in Lima, and they come, which is a big if, you have to pay their gas for coming. And why is that? Well, they don't have funds to pay the gas, or maybe they do, but the cops are so underpaid that it's understood that they have to have corruption networks and little, tips, propinas everywhere. And that's part of how they're being paid. So like in the countryside, there's a mix of, frustration with that sort of corruption, but then also an understanding that that cop is, your second cousin's son, who's just barely making it. And so you see the kind of human face on even that kind of petty state corruption in that way. Another example would be, one of the biggest props, I think Alan Garcia said, like, Peru's biggest export is cocaine or something. He said, transnational commodity. Like that has always propped up the economy of Peru. It has been a cocaine industry, has been a soft landing for some of the peasantry. That doesn't mean that it's good or that's the way they should live. It just means that that is what the social welfare program is. It's cocaine. You know what I mean? That's the social welfare program. So you're going to have a different relationship to that if you're like in the coca growing valley than maybe other places. You're going to see it as a necessary evil. But that doesn't also mean that we give up on it, because, you know, it's not that everybody has to do. Well, first of all, we should say that there's plenty of corruption that goes on in the West. It's just so much better hidden, you know? And that's what I love about Peru, is like so much stuff comes to light. And aren't we all just waiting for the rest of those Vladi videos to come out? Like, aren't we all waiting for that shoe to drop? Like, I just know they're going to come out at some point. Whereas I don't think that urine tape from Russia is ever going to happen, you know? But in Peru, just like, it just always comes to light somehow. I just have a feeling it will.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that Fujimori burned those tapes. Can I just
Someone's got a copy.
Sorry, because I think that this is an interesting back and forth, but I do want to pick up Mark's point that it is important to distinguish sort of what I was talking about and what you're talking about, Caroline, is sort of the, you know, everyday life. Corruption is almost part of it because of the way things are. That is very different from what I was talking about before, which is, you know, political actors like Cesar Acuña or Manuel Merino or Jose Luna, right, using their private universities to basically remove a president, co-opt the institutions of the state so that they can stop the political reforms that president that they just removed from office was implementing. And yeah, you said earlier, Mark, that those were kind of modest and technical reforms, but those reforms are what they're reacting against. Term limits on Congress, limits on parliamentary immunity. That's huge. One of the reasons they all want to be in Congress isn't because they want to be in Congress, because they don't want to go to jail. They want to keep criming, right? And the other one was you can, if you have charges, criminal charges against you, you cannot run for office now. Guess what? That means half the people who need and want to run for office cannot. Those are the things. Oh, and the education reforms. Those are the things you can watch in the next 10 days. If this government stands, all those reforms are going to be rolled back, because that is what is going to allow them to entrench themselves in power and continue enriching themselves at the cost of everyone else.
And as we're leaning into the final minutes of our panel, maybe, you know, one last round of remarks about something that at least 4 people have asked over the last hour: actions from abroad. You know, we're a community abroad. We're a community outside Peru at the moment. What can folks do to help protesters, to spread the word, to raise awareness? What would be your recommendation?
That's a really good question. We still have representatives in Congress who will take action in situations like this, and who will write letters or send messages or tweet to the Peruvian authorities saying, you know, this does not look so good. Y'all should, you know, rethink what you're doing. Or maybe pressure constitutional court. You know, you not only should hold a hearing on Wednesday, you need to rule on this because the country is burning. People are getting killed. People are dying out there. So we could write letters to members of Congress, our members, especially those who were in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The shakeup hasn't happened yet. The new members of Congress won't take office until January. So the same guys are still there, you know, Leahy, Engels, Jim McGovern in the House. Your own senators, write to them, your own representatives in Congress. You can write to them and say, you know, Peru is really, really on fire. You should be doing something about it. Or if you're a Peruvian American, say, I'm from Peru. My parents, my relatives are facing, you know, terrible situation in Peru. What are we doing to help them? I mean, that's worth doing. But I think that drawing attention to what's happening, as we've been already saying, is really important. Write a letter to your local editor. Get your local press to cover what's happening. Write about it yourself on Twitter or Facebook. Point to, like, making sure that it's reliable sources of information, to get the word out. I don't know, those are just some ideas. The UN is really important. I mean, I don't know how individual people can contact the UN, but there's got to be some way, because the UN and the OAS are going to play an important role in this. The OAS has already expressed its concern about what's happening. And, as I said a while back, the Human Rights Watch has asked the OAS to invoke the Democratic Charter. You could flood Almagro's Twitter. Say, Almagro, you need to be on the right side here, unlike what you were in Bolivia. You need to be on the right side here, right? I don't know. I'll think of some other things maybe, and we can post it in your. Don't you have a blog, Javier? Oh, and you, Javier, you promoted this great statement by academics, Peruvianists and European and US academics who study Peru. And I think that got some really good coverage in Peru. So I think that students could do the same thing. The Latin American Studies section of LASA is also issuing, they just sent around an email this morning asking for people to sign on. So if you want to join that, just send me an email and I'll get your name on. jmburt@gmail. Oh, no, that's wrong. jmburt@gmu.edu. That's jmburt@gmu.edu.
Everything she said, do that. I agree.
Mark?
Yeah, it's a tough act to follow. I don't think that's pretty comprehensive, I think. But in all seriousness, actually comprehensive, but actually prudent advice. I mean, this is all stuff that is tangible that people can do. It's not, so I applaud that.
Well,
follow up one thing, Javier. When I was talking about that mass corruption that I was talking about at the beginning, I meant to say this and then it slipped my mind, which often happens to me. Alan Garcia, may he rest in peace, told Jaime Bailey, the entertainer / news guy, when he was considering to run for president. Do you all remember what he said to him? La plata llega sola. The money just comes by itself. It's just rained down upon you if you go to public office. That is the problem with Peru's political system. There are no checks and balances to make sure that the people in office can't simply enrich themselves. That's why people like Acuña, that's why they're fighting to stay in office, because la plata llega sola.
Indeed. And we couldn't end on a better note. I want to thank all panelists for your participation today. I want to thank the audience, and with the permission from all panelists, we are going to publish this webinar on Age of Revolutions, the online journal in which I'm surface editor. So thank you very much, and let's keep struggling, and let's hope the best.
Thank you, Javier, for organizing this. It was great seeing you and Caroline and Mark. Thanks so much.
You guys too. Thank you, Javier, Maria, everybody.
And thanks to there was 101 people at one point, and there's 54 still online. So thanks to all of you who are listening.
You guys are troopers.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Take care.